All right. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on the time zone you're in. This is Student Affairs Live. Hello and welcome. This is a wonderful opportunity. If you're looking for Heather Shea Gasser, she is traveling the world, I believe, in the Netherlands right now. This is Keith Edwards. I'm filling as guest host. We want to welcome you to Student Affairs Live, the online learning community for student affairs educators. Today we'll be talking about men and masculinities in higher education. You can participate in today's episode by following along on the back channel and tweeting to the hashtag HigherEdLive. Thank you to Erica Thompson for helping out with the back channel today. She's going to be chiming in on tweets and sending messages our way. In a moment, I'll introduce you to the guests, but we can't do that without first giving a shout out to the sponsors that make Student Affairs Live possible. Student Affairs Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network, and you can tune in to episodes with your regular host, Heather Shea Gasser, and her co-host, the wonderful Tony Duty, on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're unfamiliar with past episodes, we highly recommend you check out and favorite the archive link that's getting tweeted out now. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. Are you ready to recruit the class of 2021? Learn where to focus your time and energy in marketing to teens during M. Stoner's next free webinar, Myth-Busting Admissions, where prospects and professionals agree and disagree on enrollment marketing, messages, and channels. We'll tweet out a link shortly where you can sign up. This is also sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators. Well, proud sponsor of Student Affairs Live, one of the many ways you can be innovative with your own professional development. ACPA is home to the Coalition on Men and Masculinities. Two of our guests today, Tracy and Dan, have both served as chairs for this entity. We encourage you to check it out, engage, and get involved. Now, on with today's episode. Today I'm joined by four wonderful folks who I admire and respect a great deal. Well, we thought we would have four. Unfortunately, Rachel Wagner, Associate Director of Residence Life at Iowa State, had a flight delay and won't be able to join us. We're sad to miss Rachel's wisdom and insight, but we still have three great panelists. Tracy Davis is Professor and College Student Personnel Program Coordinator and Founding Director of the Center for the Study of Masculinities and Men's Development. Wilson Okello is an instructor, research associate, and doctoral student in Student Affairs and Higher Education program at Miami University, and founder of the Truth to Power Project. And Dan Tillapaugh is Assistant Professor of Counselor Education at California Lutheran University. We have got a lot to talk about, so let's go ahead and get started. Thought we would jump right in that right now in my social media feed and on mainstream media as well, there's a great deal of media attention to the story of Brock Turner, who was convicted of rape and sentenced to 6 months in jail. This story and that sentence has brought the dynamics of sexual violence on college campuses to a wider audience than usual. Yesterday I was picking my daughters up for daycare and another parent wanted to talk with me about this, which I don't typically get those kind of conversations at daycare pickup. But it brings up an opportunity to bring up this topic with folks who aren't typically having these kinds of conversations. The topic brings up victim blaming, privilege, rape culture, alcohol, men's socializations, campus adjudication and responses, the criminal justice system, and bystander intervention. I just wanted to ask each of our panelists to chime in, and Tracy, we'll start with you. Just what has come up for you related to our topic today as you've watched this story unfold?
Well, I haven't. If you're looking to me to be the social media guru, you're looking in the wrong direction. But I have been keeping up on the story. Fortunately, it's been one that social media has kept in front of us, and in fact, sometimes better than the larger media. I think a couple things struck me. As you said, there's multiple dimensions to this issue. Privilege certainly being one of them. The fact that so much attention has been given or not been given to this perpetrator. Certainly the finding from the judge, the sentencing from the judge is unbelievably is an unbelievable response in some ways and an all too believable response in other ways. I just was reading a story of an African American male 5 or 6 years ago as a 16-year-old who was brought up on sexual assault charges, and turns out they were false charges, but he was convicted and was given a 6-year sentence under virtually no evidence. In this situation, you had all kinds of evidence. In fact, as you mentioned, they had bystanders that intervened and disrupted the event. And there's a lot of lenses you can put on this. Certainly masculinity and patriarchy and privileges is one of them. But I guess the thing that strikes me probably the most is I've been doing sexual assault work like I know you have, Keith, for a lot of years, and the fact that this can continue to happen and the discourse that follows is very similar to the way it was 20, 40, 100 years ago is problematic.
Yeah, I also think it's a bit of a sign that we're having these conversations, and that there is this outrage. I think that outrage is in some ways new. I mean, this is not the first time that someone's conviction has received a light sentence, but it really seems to be a different approach, which is maybe a sign of progress. Wilson, what do you want to add around this topic in our conversation today?
Yeah, you mentioned the idea of the sentencing and the sort of the relative outrage that social media has been promulgating. For me, I think it's not a for me the outrage isn't new. I think it depends on the communities that we're talking about, right? And so as Tracy mentioned, there's stories, and it's one of several where I think the readings of masculine bodies, who are racialized masculine bodies, gets read differently, and sentencing is sort of exercised differently. And so, I think this has been a conversation going on in some communities for a long time. And this is I guess another chapter to that, right? And so I start to think about places of intervention and how do we begin to sort of intervene, as these things are happening. How do we begin not only to critique patriarchy, but also the ways in which historically this has happened in different communities, and so the rules that exist for some bodies in terms of perpetuating this narrative. And so,
yeah, Dan, what would you like to add?
I think for me personally, I appreciate Wilson's discussion of sort of racialized bodies and masculinity piece. As he was talking about that, I was thinking about my colleagues Chris Linder and Jessica Harris and their work around sexual violence, and talking about some of the pieces around that historically, if we look, the numbers have not changed in terms of the number of sexual assaults that happen on colleges and universities for decades. I mean, it's just been the same number over and over. And when we think about all of the sort of best practices or the things that we try in terms of interventions, they clearly have not necessarily made a sweeping change. And I think that is a real problem. And I think this case, certainly, I think the attention from the Hunting Ground documentary and the folks who are doing great work in terms of End Rape on Campus and other organizations are putting this issue at the forefront. Certainly Title IX does that as well, and the work that's needing to happen. But I'm struck by a lot of these things. One, I have to say, I was struck by the father's response, right? So the use of this 20 minutes that, sort of as if that wasn't 20 minutes of hell for that survivor, and how much she has sort of put out of herself, and the work of her letter, all of these pieces. I mean, for me, I'm really struck by that, and also recognize that that's a huge emotional weight to carry and a burden, right? And so, the other piece that I was looking at this morning on social media, a friend of mine had posted a piece from Democracy Now! Talking about the juxtaposition of the case of Jasmine Richards in California, who is an activist with Black Lives Matter, and the fact that she was going to be facing jail time of up to 4 years as a Black woman. And meanwhile, this white, privileged, heterosexual male is getting 6 months in jail for conviction of rape. It just, that's so disparate to me, and it really it brings up so much that's just on my mind in terms of how our justice system is set up, how we need to make change, how we also then need to also take that down to the campus level and make changes within our campus policies and the ways that we are connecting with young men around consent, around sexual violence, all of these issues. So a lot for me that's there. And additionally, I also want to say, as more and more social media pieces come out, I think that it's important. And at the same time, I can't help but think about survivors who also are triggered by the constant news feeds that are happening as well. And so how to balance both of those complexities, right? And so how can we also support our friends, our colleagues on social media who are survivors and just can't keep hiding or blocking everyone from seeing that content? So I think that's another piece of this that I think is also important to consider.
Yeah, I think I was in that conversation in the driveway yesterday. I was struck with this person who really felt like this was a really unusual case. Mm-hmm. And I'm struck with what's unusual about this case is that there was a conviction. Mm. And because there was a conviction, now we have an opportunity to talk about sentencing, when really convictions rarely happen. Less than 1% of sexual assaults and rapes end up in a conviction because people don't report, they don't trust the criminal justice system. But it is opening it up to people who don't have that conversation normally, and I think that can be helpful in broadening the conversation beyond people who are typically having it. One of the folks on Twitter, Jenny Hemingway, said, "Will outrage translate to action?" And I think that's the challenge. And how can we leverage that? And then we also really need to make sure we're engaging in culture change, because it's the culture change that has led to this, has led to the victim blaming, has led to judges' decisions, has led to the father's response, has led to the friend's response, has led to some of the things that the survivor herself is experiencing. So lots to unpack there. So I appreciate you sort of jumping in with what's going on right now, which is certainly heavy and weighs on me for sure. And I know the work that many of you do, and probably have many survivors who are listening to this and watching this as well, and heavy for them. So I want to recognize that. I want to shift to broadening the conversation. We kind of zoomed in on men and masculinities and sexual violence there and what's currently happening in the media. I want to zoom out and get a broader picture about men and masculinities and what's going on. And Tracy, you've been at this longer than the rest of us. You've had that honor. Many of us have learned from your scholarship and your thinking and your mentorship. I certainly have. And I'm wondering if you can offer us that perspective. How have you seen the study of men and masculinities in higher education change over time in higher education?
Well, I appreciate your kind words. Right before I answer that question, if anyone has any questions why a survivor might not report the assault right away, you might want to take a look at this survivor's letter that she wrote. It's a pretty powerful commentary, just a very brave, let me say that, a very brave response to the craziness that's happening around her. And I just think it's worth hearing her voice. So I know it's gotten a lot of reads, but it's worth listening to. But thanks for your nice words. I'm not sure everybody who I've mentored or read my scholarship would agree that it's been as positive as you suggest. I appreciate your comments, though. You know, one of the ways that this has changed that I've seen in the last 20+ years is that, well, first of all, you have scholars like Wilson and Dan and Rachel Wagner and Sean Harper, and a whole, Frank Harris, Susan Marine, Chris Linder, Z. Nicolazzo, Chase Catalano, just a whole host of folks doing outstanding work that are complicating what we used to think of men and masculinities as embodied masculinity. We used to think of men and maleness rather than masculinity and the social, institutional, systemic impact, similar to race. And the construction of masculinity has been constructed in some ways like race, this construction to serve to privilege some folks, give benefits, distribute benefits to some folks, and oppress others, target others. So I see a major shift kind of in second wave feminism back in the 60s and 70s, 80s. I still see the thing of gender in binary ways and in embodied ways. So I think one of the things that I've been happy to see happen is an acknowledgement of the multiple dimensions of identity and how those intersect and operate, multiple layers of identity, intersectionality and context and history. So it's given us this appropriate focus on thinking of how masculinity is constructed, how it exists beyond men's development, and moves us away from simplistic notions so that we contextualize masculinities. We think of the power associated with that. Mm-hmm. And it also moves us away from this gender binary where trans identity, where as Halberstam and others have written, women have masculinity, men have femininity. Moving this out of the body into these larger issues is where I hope we go. And I guess one other thing, I hope we move. Judith Butler's work on performativity does some of the same thing. Like her scholarship is a result of disembodying masculinity or disembodying gender and looking at it as the performance and what that looks like, what that means, how that influences material consequences for lives, for people. So I hope we go in two directions in the future. One is a critical approach that continues to interrogate masculinity, but I want that balanced with the compassionate approach as well. Those might seem diametrically opposed, but I think once you dissolve that duality between critical and compassionate, I think you find some ways to work with institutional and people rather than either-oring those, kind of working together with those tensions and find that space between where we can continue to make people's lives better. I mean, that's what this should be about.
Right. Wonderful. A quick look back and look into the future, too. I really appreciate that, Tracy, and challenging the binary and the social construction of gender and how we think about that, and critical scholarship is really great. Wilson, you're particularly focused on the study and research and the practice of pedagogy of liberation. How does this integrate with the study of men and masculinities for you?
Yeah. Tracy, I do want to say I appreciate your thoughts around criticality and compassion. For me, I agree. I don't think they're diametrically opposed. I actually think about criticality as an act of love. And so as we think about the work, and so thank you for that. Also, I want to just kind of steer right back to something, to the conversation Dan was having around particularly interventions and what we can do for campus policies. And I've been thinking about what we would have to forfeit, or what we would have to give up in order for some policies to move forward. And so I think that's a question that's really lingering for me in terms of my own sort of masculine projections, but also when we think about how patriarchy exists, I think we need to really start asking ourselves, what are we willing to forfeit and what are we willing to give up so that policies that address this and intervene in particular can move forward. And so I want to sort of mention those points. But in terms of my own work, Keith, to your question, yes, my work, it does center on agency and the achievement of agency as a formula for really moving through the world with authority. And so we know that the body is a social instrument, as Tracy mentioned, which figuratively holds projections and inscriptions within its frame. Now, these imposed inscriptions are often not ones that we would choose for ourselves. Sometimes we may, but oftentimes they're imposed upon us, right? And so with each new iteration, which with popular culture, the promulgation of it, and other public and private apparatuses, the body is burdened by new ideas and these new ideologies of who it should be and what it should be, right? And so, and for me, when we talk about agency or with the access to agency, I think it allows for one to define their own reality is what happens. And so these instruments and these apparatus used to facilitate these inscriptions are then weakened and somewhat inapplicable, right? And so because I think agency, right, when we talk about liberation, agency in particular creates a space in which it says that even though these forces are against me, I'm choosing to move forward in this particular way, right? So it creates this liminal space within these larger structures of oppression that I think grant agency to individuals. And so, in particular, it's undergirded with Black feminism and Black feminist thought in particular, right? I think which allows for us again to define for defining space, right? I think it's a formidable tool of disruption and revolutionary across gender and sexuality because of the emphasis it places on standpoint politics and dialectics. Now, standpoint politics, as Patricia Okello talks about, talks about how Black women occupy a unique standpoint that is unavailable to others, right? Their particular locations in race, gender, sex, sexuality, and class. It grants them a unique insight into the world, right? Now, for me, I think if we can, as we think about the Black woman's experience, right, and we acknowledge that they experience domination in all its forms, right? Black women, Black trans women experience domination in all its forms, then we should probably be theorizing from this place because their freedom necessitates everybody's freedom, right? And so this is sort of how it kind of comes back and intervenes in men and masculinities work because, again, if we can start to think differently about how we theorize, then I think ultimately we can begin to sort of deconstruct these systems of patriarchy. And so that's standpoint politics. In terms of dialectics, in terms of ways of being, so in Black feminist theory, it allows for different ways of being. So one can be both vulnerable and courageous. They can be outrageous and serious, independent, but also reliant on relationships, right? So there's just different ways of being that may seem diametrically opposed, but really aren't, right? But they allow for all of that to be wrapped up in the body. So again, allows for self-definition within this, which offered me, in terms of my own positionality, an alternative vision to construct my own masculine identity, right? One that was not beholden to the dated tropes of Black patriarchy. And so, and then on top of that, there's this idea of self-love that was evident, right? And I think going back to, some of what Tracy was talking about, I think for me, self-love is, I think in this Black body for me, right? To show up in the world, is disruption, right? It means disruption. But I think if we can affirm oneself, right, I think that's an act of self-love and revolution, right? Because we're not taught how to love, and we're not taught how to affirm ourselves in these very powerful ways. And so Bell Hooks talks a lot about self-love, and when she talks about acceptance and self-responsibility and self-assertiveness and living purposefully, right? So if we can wrap all these ideas up with love and self-definition, I think we can get at an agency that allows us to move through the world again with authority. And so, so that would be, I guess hopefully that answers your question. In terms of how that looks in practice, for me, I utilize a lot of creativity, particularly poetry, in my work. And so, I think that the creative process, particularly poetic performance, is an embodied practice that allows us to be both emotional, to capture both emotion and the body, to reconnect mind, body, and spirit in some really powerful ways. And so, and to define ourselves, right, in public, right? And so there's this sort of public testimony that happens in and through creativity that I think is a unique space and can be powerful when we think about granting, giving permission for individuals to define themselves in the world. And so,
yeah, I think that how you live that out fully, what you described, is really a lifetime's work, right?
I agree, absolutely. This isn't an sort of overnight practice, but
no, and what a wonderful lifetime's work.
Sure, absolutely.
To be working in the struggle and the process of that, and I'm reminded in both Tracy's comments and your comments, Wilson, about Bell Hook's reminder that binary thinking, the either or, the binary of gender, the binary of critique or compassion, is dominator thinking. Sure. And the more we can be reminded of that, I think that comes easily to many of us now that we have I certainly have a much broader view of what gender is than I once did when I started researching this. But that applies to so many things in life, that the binary thinking often locks us into traps that aren't really real. So thanks to you both. Yeah. And over to Dan, you've looked deeply in your research at experiences of gay men's masculinity and their identity, and your most recent, as far as I know, work is the research on the lived experience of sexual violence of men, both cisgender and trans men, and their experience of sexual violence. What is most salient to you in that research, both as a scholar and as a human being?
Yeah. Thanks. I'm struck by Tracy's comments about sort of the intersectional work around masculinity. And for me, I think when I first started reading the men and masculinities literature and scholarship, one of the things that stood out to me was a lot of it just didn't speak to who I was and my own lived experience. A lot of it was shaped around sort of the experience of like an aggregate men as typically white, heterosexual, middle class, U.S. bound, right? So it goes on and on. And a lot of that just didn't, I just questioned. My copy of Guyland was like scribble notes of like, this doesn't work for me, or this doesn't, yeah, I can understand that, but there's something else here. And so, I think for me, my research is really me-search and trying to understand sort of my own lived experiences and all of that. And, I think for me, I'm drawn to understanding parts of this work around men and masculinities that I think typically are under-discussed, often sort of pushed to the margin or rendered invisible, and sometimes also taboo, right? So like talking about gay men's sense of masculinity or college men who survived sexual violence, we just don't talk about this because it makes people uncomfortable. And so I guess too, I'm wanting to agitate a little bit in my work, right? So I'm like a maybe budding scholar activist a little bit. There's a part of me that likes that, and a part of me that's sort of like, okay, have to figure that out. But for me, these stories become important because they aren't represented largely within the larger scholarship, and for especially the current research that I'm doing with men who are survivors, I think it's just incredibly important because oftentimes when we frame conversations on sexual violence, that false binary of woman as survivor and man as perpetrator gets sort of reinforced over and over and over. And even if there's a statistic that gets brought in about men can be survivors, it's often sort of done as almost a one talking point, and then we go back to the language that's gendered, right? Of male perpetrators and female survivors, or women survivors, and men, and that's one of my bigger issues of like even language, which will be down the line. So I think that's one thing that comes to mind for me. It's just been really powerful, often disturbing. You know, out of the 15 men that I've interviewed around the sexual violence study, 11 of them are working or in graduate prep programs in higher ed. And so we have this study of 11 folks who work in our field, or will be working in our field, that are survivors. And most have never shared with their supervisor, and often are then asked to, unbeknownst to their supervisors, go and deal with sexual violence reporting, or issues that come up in the residence halls. Some who have been experiencing their violence in their workplaces by supervisors, by mentors, by classmates in their grad prep programs. So this is a larger piece that I think is just, we haven't talked about it. Folks are not talking about it. They don't. There's a lot of fear and shame wrapped up around this, and I think being able to sort of voice that is just becoming really important, and I'm really glad to be able to engage in this work.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're glad you're engaging in it, learning a lot from you. You mentioned the notion of the terms male and female, and men and women, and you've been explicit about including both cisgender and trans men in your most recent research on sexual violence. That was highlighted very clearly in the call that went out for participants, and how you've described it and how you've written about that. Do you just want to say a little bit more about that? I think that's really important.
Yeah, you know, for me, I think one of the critiques around sort of men and male, oftentimes in the literature, right, especially earlier on, I would say, although sometimes you still see it now, being used as a synonym, to me, I think those are very different terms, right? And so I define, and I'm trying to be very explicit, when I'm using male, I'm talking about sex. When I'm talking about men, I'm talking about gender. One can identify as both, but not everybody does, and so I just think that that's a really important sort of distinction within our work. Language becomes really important, and while other people will say, oh, that's semantics, I say no, it's very real for folks, right, in terms of their identity of sex and their identity of gender, and then how that gets embodied and performed becomes important. For me, I really felt like as I was doing reading of current of existing literature, one, there was just not a lot of conversation about men who were survivors of sexual violence, particularly, I mean, anywhere, but then particularly in higher ed. And then when I'm reading statistics, like 50% of folks who identify as transgender are likely to be survivors of sexual violence throughout the span of their life, and that LGBT people are 3 more times likely to be survivors of sexual violence throughout their lifespan than their heterosexual peers. To me, it became, I have to be able to engage both transgender and cisgender men, and I want to hear their stories, because yes, they may be different, but they're still experiencing the same institutional sort of response, and that became a big piece of the study and the work. And they're still affected by the socialization of masculinity, regardless of whether you're trans or whether you're cis, and that also becomes really important. And so again, going back to sort of Tracy's point about the intersectionality of this, within the sample, I have folks who identify in different sexual minority groups. I have heterosexual men. I have cisgender, transgender men, men from different racial backgrounds, different social classes, right? So, and different geographical regions across the U.S. And so that intersectional piece becomes really important in terms of understanding that. And there are differences and distinctions. But for me, I just felt like all of that really I wanted to make sure that trans men were a part of this.
Yeah, no, I think that's really critical, and I think if what we're doing is studying or talking about or discussing the social experience of being gendered as a man, then we shouldn't be really using male.
Mm-hmm.
If
Right.
we're studying something else that's biological, then maybe, but that so easily just slip in our language, I think. So I really appreciate you clarifying that. Well, we've had an opportunity to kind of hear from each of you in quite a bit of depth about the work that you're doing. I kind of want to move it around a little bit more quickly now, maybe get each of you to chime in, or we don't need to have all three of you chime in on these, but one of the things that I'm often asked is about healthy masculinities, and I think this is a new trending topic, and I remember 20 years ago asking Paul Kivel, who's a prolific scholar of men and masculinities, should we be trying to change the definition of what it means to be a man, or should we be trying to get rid of it altogether? And he said, well, that's a good question. Good luck with that. And I had sort of come to him as this all-knowing person, which is a great reminder about how he engages his work. But as we think about the conversation around healthy masculinities, what do you all think about? Do you think we should be working to create more positive and healthy definitions of masculinities? Or should we be seeking to remove gender roles altogether? Any thoughts on that?
Well, good luck trying to remove gender roles altogether. On the other hand, it is a great question. That should be my response, right? What a great question, Keith. You know, as I've thought about, even when I was thinking of naming the center, you know, I've tried to come up with some creative ideas for what kind of masculinity. I've thought about this a lot. Like, what kind of masculinity do I want for myself? What kind of masculinity do I want for my sons? What kind of masculinity do I want to promote? And the only thing that makes sense to me right now, and I am way unfinished on this, as I am with most things, is I'm very suspicious of any language that talks about healthy or positive or any form of masculinity that isn't to some degree self-authored, because we have a long history of what it means to attach social meaning. And so whose definition of healthy do we use? Whose definition of positive do we use? So I kind of like the language of conscious masculinity, because I know when I spend more time thinking of being conscious of what's happening in my environment, be conscious of what I've learned, what's been inscribed in me, then the more conscious I am of bringing myself to this conversation, to other conversations, rather than just pulling out the dogma, just all that stuff that I've learned over the years. So I try to be conscious. So I like the term conscious masculinity.
Dan or Wilson, anything you want to add to that?
You know, I'm thinking about, so gender roles, I think are really difficult to, and I think we could eliminate gender roles if there weren't consequences still for what it meant to hold certain identities, right? And so because we still live in a system of that, right, that is built, first of all, built on patriarchy, but I think it benefits certain identities and projections of masculinity. I think like the idea of a conscious masculinity is something that I think I can get on board with. I think about this, the authoring you mentioned, right? The ability to define one's own masculinity, that maybe not, you know, positive or healthy, but it's conscious, right? I think is useful, right, for a way forward. But I think it's a difficult question.
Yeah.
At best. So yeah.
I think I've tried to think about it as authentic masculinity, which sounds similar and a little bit different from yours, Tracy, around conscious masculinity. And the comments remind me that another binary that I think we often fall into is we're going to try and change the system, or we're going to help people successfully navigate the system as it exists, which we have to do both. And we can do both. We can work to change the system and help people survive in navigating the system. And so, although I don't really resonate with healthy masculinities, I understand the strategy in some people in the audiences in using some of that. I'm wondering, we started off talking about with what's in the news around sexual violence and Brock Turner and the criminal justice system and privilege and rape culture. Let's also bring in another current topic. We are in an election year. And I'm wondering what gender tropes and what kind of hegemonic traditional gendered norms that you've noted in the current political arena. Have you seen any of that happening at all?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think I know you're being facetious. I mean, I think there's a lot of hegemonic stuff happening within the political arena, and I think what I think also when I've been doing some talks recently around equity and sort of how it shows up on campus, you know, college and university campuses are a microcosm of larger society, and so when we then see, you know, shocking incidents at UCSD outside of the Cultural Center for Latino students on campus that's reinforcing Trump's message of build the wall, deport Latinos back, deport Mexicans back over the border. You know, like that stuff becomes so entrenched, and then how then we can create discourse and dialogue towards action, right? And so a lot of that I think is critical, and so the hegemonic masculinity that's showing up is really, really pervasive around a whole bunch of issues. I mean, whether it's male privilege, whether it's about white privilege, whether it's about class privilege. I mean, all you know, again, not trying to reinforce a binary, and really be all of those things are happening here, and even it's all parties, right? Like, I mean, there's still things that are happening across the board, and so for me, it's been frightening, quite honestly, to sort of like watch it, because I know that that's also modeling for younger people a way of dialogue and discourse, and it's not, right? It's not even dialogue or discourse. It's just like shouting and yelling who can be louder, and I think that's really really scary, because we have to then unpack that for folks, and I'm not sure that we are doing an adequate job of that largely, especially for men, seeing that as examples of how to engage with one another.
You know, I saw where Dartmouth University is teaching a class on Black Lives Matter. Somebody around this group or somebody online that's listening right now ought to teach a course using Trump as to deconstruct masculinity influences on much of this behavior. You don't have to spend much time doing it. I mean, we talked about hand size, for crying out loud. You know, there's a lot of in the discourse, in the public discourse, pick up a paper. I agree with what Dan said earlier about how language, some people tend to think it's simply semantics. I would say it is semantics, but it's not simply semantics. You unfold that stuff, and you can find, if you decontextualize it, recontextualize it, deconstruct it, and take a look at it, it's pretty telling. The language around whiteness is very similar. Ways that we promote colorblindness reifies white privilege and keeps us from talking about important topics. So on the one hand, I kind of like that Trump is out there and getting as much attention. I agree with Dan that I find it very problematic, and then like one side of my brain gets really kind of disconcerted, and then another part of my brain's like, wow, I don't have to look very hard to find examples for my teaching. Mm-hmm. And you pick up the paper, turn on the television, it's right there in front of us. Mm-hmm. But then connect it to a critical approach. Paulo Freire talks about moving from ingenious curiosity to epistemological curiosity, to inspiring people frameworks for understanding what's going on around them. Like, I don't need to convince people that we live in a patriarchy. You shouldn't have to convince people that you live in a white supremacist culture. It just kind of is what it is. If you have some filters for understanding what's going on around you, there's sources of liberation for white folks within white supremacist ideology. There's a way of resisting and moving against, providing a counter narrative to patriarchal perspectives that can move us towards liberation. What Wilson describes as agency, I think, I hope we have an opportunity to do work together in the future, because I think you're right on target with on the one hand we expose oppression, and that needs to happen, but again, not either-oring it, expose it and provide agency, both primarily for people who are targeted for it, but also show people who are privileged by it the agency they can have. What liberation is provided to folks who have been unconscious of how their identity is inscribed upon them. I mean, I would think everybody would be interested in being aware of what the world makes of us, so that we can make something of ourselves.
You know, that really resonates with me. I mean, Dan referred earlier to his research is really me search, and I think when I was doing my research around college men's gender identity development, what got me out of bed at 6 o'clock in the morning to transcribe and code and write was I was learning about myself and my dad and my college friends and my relationship with my partner, and I was just so eager to discover that. And learning to be more conscious around gender was incredibly liberating for me as someone with a lot of privilege, and certainly around my cisgender gender identity. And so I certainly found the liberation in that. Now that I have 2 daughters, I'm feeling like I'm not nearly as conscious as I was allowed to let myself believe. It's one thing to do it theoretically. It's a whole other thing to do with children who you love and you care about and you're worried about. So, Wilson, did you want to have comments about the current political arena, or do you want to pass?
I'll pass.
You'll pass. All right.
This one.
Well, we have a question from Twitter from, I think, Kevin Carey. Yeah, who wanted to ask, how do we begin engaging fraternity men in developing healthy masculinities? Where do we begin? And I've been thinking about this question a lot as I'm helping to organize a institute with the Student Conduct Administration Association and fraternity and sorority associations. And it occurs to me that if we didn't have fraternities and sororities, and we had the issues around gender, maybe not the gender binary and trans folks, but we had the issues around sexual violence and men's drinking and the role of athletes in sexual violence, one idea that some smart person might come up with is, what if we organized gender groups organized around core values, had them live together, and engage in service and academics around that? That might be a pretty good idea. And I think in theory it is a pretty good idea, and then of course in reality that often is not really the lived experience of that. So are there thoughts about how we can really utilize the potential that is there with fraternities and sororities to advance the conversation around men and masculinities, women and femininities, trans and gender nonconforming folks, and pushing the binary around gender?
Okay, I used to be a Greek advisor, and I've actually found Greeks to be responsive. I've worked with Greeks who are the least responsive folks I've ever interacted with, the least developmentally open, and some the most. So, like you suggested, Keith, the structures themselves seem to be set up to be able to do some pretty cool developmental work, some pretty good social justice work, some pretty good learning. I'm reminded of a mentor of mine who, J.Q. Adams, who always challenges me to think, you know, when I start complaining about somebody not getting it or somebody not understanding, he'll say, who doesn't understand? And from an Eastern perspective, that's an elusive kind of question. And when I ask myself that question, a lot of times it's my ego that's driving, my own unfamiliarity or insecurity around or fear of the issue. When I really put the onus of doing social justice work on my own shoulders and say, Tracy, how are you going to approach this in a way that's liberating as opposed to taking their inventory? I think I do it better. And so that doesn't answer your question from a strategy standpoint or from a outcome standpoint, but from a process standpoint, the more I think about myself as a student affairs professional or a faculty member in that learning environment, people surprise me. People will disappoint me. I disappoint other people. But I think if we invite people to capacity and hold Greeks especially, hold them accountable to their values, because I don't think it's in a lot of the charters or a lot of the ritual or a lot of the missions that what they do is some of the stuff that they end up doing. I think we've moved away from that. If they get back to who they are and start being conscious of what their values are, there's a way to use language where it might sound like a left and a right perspective. You work that space between and you can find some common understanding where, but that's what this work looks like. It's that frustrating, it's that long, it's that difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tracy, I like what you mentioned about the idea of values, and to build on that, I think about what has inherently become destructive about the words brotherhood and sisterhood, right? That allows for the type of things we see, particularly around hazing and or, some of the ideological blind spots that exist within those definitions. And so how do we begin to maybe add to what those definitions are, right, in ways that are explicit, right? So what does it mean for our charter to include not only, you talked about social justice, like to actually include like the activism toward XYZ, right? Or not just the promotion of social justice, but right, what does it look tangibly for us to respond to or to take on feminist ideals and or critical masculine ideals, right? And so maybe adding those to the charter and not just sort of allowing them to be these under the auspice of brotherhood, sisterhood could be helpful, right? So helping charters or chapters to redefine that, to write them out, visit the history, one, but to your point, but also maybe add to it. So,
I think one of the things that comes to mind for me, and I know that the question is bound to fraternity and sororities, and I respect that. And I'm going to move it slightly in a different direction. I think one of the things that I see is that if we are having the first conversations about consent and sexual violence in college, it's way too late, right? And I think one of the things that higher ed folks who are invested in making change around these issues of sexual violence, we need to be starting to be more proactive in advocating for larger conversations around consent, masculinities, all of these things at a younger age, right? So when we think about sexual education in high schools, in middle schools, often there is very little conversation around consent or masculinities, right? One of the things that came out in the sexual violence study that I did, one of the participants said, if you want to make a change in sexual violence, you have to change masculinity, right? So we have to have conversation with people across gender around how we're socialized in many ways and complicit in many ways to uphold rape culture and violence, right? So we're constantly operating under the assumption that we aren't violent to other people. Well, there's lots of violences. There's many violences that we enact. I mean, whether that's a microaggression or other pieces, I mean, all of those build up. And I think, to me, there's also this permeated culture of rape culture that then gets reinforced, whether it's fraternity and sorority life or other examples, right? So an understanding that happens across campus. It doesn't have to just be student athletes or fraternity men. And so to me, I think there's a larger piece of how can we shift? How can we adapt the conversation to have all folks, start thinking about the ways in which we process messages, make meaning of those messages, and then either reject or uphold them in key ways. And I think that's a critical piece of this as well. And I think, the dialogues, the conversational pieces that all have been shown to have great progress in college campuses, and especially with fraternity men. I have conversations about that. Get people involved in it as peer educators. Give them opportunities. I think those are also critical pieces. So keep working at it. But what else systemically can we implement to make that change?
Yeah, that's so profound. I think when I talk with college audiences about consent, all the college staff say you really need to get to them in high schools. And when I talk to high schools, they say you really need to get to them in junior high. Mm-hmm. And I spend a lot of time watching kindergartners play, and there's a lot of bad messages about consent. 6-year-olds or 2-year-olds being told you really need to hug grandma, whether you like it or not. It goes back to the very beginning of that. We're going to get a link to 6 ways we unintentionally perpetuate rape culture with children tweeted out. So it's such a salient point, Dan. We're just about out of time. I want to do just a quick round. I'm going to challenge our panelists to share with us a gender scholar who's really engaging you right now, who's really pushing you to think differently in new ways, who's really nudging you. And what I'm going to challenge you to do is share one, and just share one and very briefly what they are, and don't go on and on about how wonderful they are. That'll be the challenge. Dan, we'll start with you. Who's a scholar on gender, particularly men and masculinities, who's really exciting you currently?
I am really excited to get into T.J. Jurian's dissertation on transmasculine men. I think it's going to really be important work to really bring up additional pieces of conversation for trans-identified men. And so I'm excited for that.
Awesome. Tracy, how about you?
This is a hard question. I'm going to... Bell Hooks has probably been the most profound scholar I've read in over my career. Her movement from slicing and dicing and deconstructing and telling the truth to now doing that, and as Wilson had suggested earlier, balancing that with this deep compassion and seeing criticality as an act of love, and that's how I experience it as well. And Bell Hooks.
Well, Wilson, you're a doctoral student, so we saved you for last. You would have no trouble coming up with this. So who's one person who's really exciting to you around gender and around men and masculinities?
I'm going to put an interdisciplinary lens on it and say Ta-Nehisi Coates. I think that if you haven't had an opportunity to read Between the World and Me, I think it offers some really keen insight on the intersections of race, of gender, sex, and class. And so I'll say Ta-Nehisi Coates right now.
Wonderful. And a nudge beyond the academy, too. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to all three of you, and thank you to Rachel Wagner, who is not able to join us, but has helped all four of us learn and grow along our journey. Her wisdom certainly was shared here, just not by her.
Indeed.
Thank
Absolutely.
Rachel for what she's taught us. Thank you to our guests today, and thanks always to our program sponsors. You can receive reminders about these and other great shows by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can also browse the archives at Higher Ed Live or subscribe to the iTunes podcast. I recently learned that more people listen to the podcast than watch the show. So maybe people will hear our voices who don't see our faces. I'm Keith Edwards. It's really an honor to be able to fill in for my good friend Heather Shea Gasser. She will be back along with other episodes with her and with Tony Duty. Thanks for watching, everyone. We hope you have a great week. Thank you all.